Hello and welcome to this session as part of the Guidance Counsellors Conference 2021. I'm Rachel, I'm the Head of Student Recruitment and Marketing at Cambridge, and during this session I'm going to be talking to you about supercurricular. So what is supercurricular? How can it help students to make a more competitive application? And I'll be running through some ideas about things that you can do and things that you can suggest to your students to really start exploring that supercurricular work. But first, a bit of a recap on what we're looking for. So I know in other presentations as part of the conference, my colleagues will have run through the application process, and you'll know that there's lots of different pieces of information that we look at to get the best idea as possible about whether the student will be a good fit for the course at Cambridge. Really what we're looking for is for students to show that academic ability and potential. So we want to know that they're going to be a really good fit for the course at Cambridge. And we also want to know that they're really going to enjoy studying the course and the subject at that higher level. So supercurricular work is a great way for them to be able to demonstrate some of that throughout the application process. We want to see that they're engaging in that work, so they're able to take that subject knowledge that they have and apply it in situations which are maybe a little bit less familiar to them. So we want to see that they can take what they know in their subject studies from school and apply it in lots of different situations as well. Alongside that supercurricular work, we'll also be looking at the work they are doing in school. So we'll want to make sure that they're on track to meet the typical offer for the subject and course that they're applying to. And the best thing for them to do with that is just check on the course pages on our website to make sure that they're taking the right subject combinations if they need to. Some of our subjects will have particular subjects they need to have taken at school. Others might have a broader range, so do encourage them to check that nice and early. And they'll also get a good idea about the kind of level that we need them to be working at based on their A-levels or IB or whatever curriculum it is that they're studying. So all of these things on the left are the things that we'll look at throughout the application process. But these things on the right aren't things that we'll look at. So there's no typical Cambridge student. Our cohort is really diverse and we have students who come from all over the world and all kinds of different backgrounds. So what students have in common is that real thirst for knowledge and enthusiasm for their subject area. But we won't be looking for students from a particular background or who are from a particular school. It's all this stuff on the left that we'll be looking at. We also won't look at extracurricular activities. So at Cambridge, we really differentiate between what's an extracurricular and what's supercurricular. And I'll come on to that a little bit more as we go through the presentation. But the extracurricular things, so things that aren't related to their school or subject work, we won't look at as part of the application process. And again, I'll come on to that a little bit later in the presentation. But first, a bit more on supercurricular. So what is supercurricular? And for us, anything supercurricular is anything really that relates to the subject area that students are looking at applying to, and things that really stretch them or go above and beyond what they've done within the school curriculum. So things that are subject related, more academic in focus, but which don't form part of the core curriculum that they have to do. For students, it's a really good thing for them to do to start exploring that subject in more detail and really actually to decide whether the course is the right one for them. So often when we're out and about, students will maybe be choosing between a couple of different subjects that they're interested in. So maybe a couple of things that they're studying at school that they quite like, but they're not really sure which one they're going to pick for their university studies. And actually supercurricular work can be a great way for them to start deciding about that. So that's really things like reading or watching documentaries or maybe doing some more advanced problems in some of the maths and science subjects to get a bit of a more informed idea about what that subject is going to be like at a higher level and if they really enjoy that kind of level of study. So it's good for the students to make sure that they're making the right choice, really. It can also help them to gain broader knowledge in that subject area. So it can help them to get a wider base, really start getting some experience of applying that subject and their subject knowledge they already have to situations that they're maybe a bit less familiar with, which is kind of what will happen throughout the interview and other parts of the process. So getting them more comfortable with that earlier on. It can help them to explore their subject in more detail, practice things like their independent learning and research skills, which really form part of the way that they'll study at university. So demonstrating that they'll be able to work with that and work well with the kind of ways that they'll be taught at university. And then ultimately it will help them to make a really competitive application to university. So to be able to demonstrate that they've got all of that subject knowledge and really show us that they've got the enthusiasm to study that course in much more detail at a much higher level. So where should students start? And what I will say from the beginning is that it's not at all prescriptive what students do for their supercurricular work. So for some students, it might be reading that they like doing, and that might form a big part of the supercurricular work that they do, and that's absolutely great. But for other students in things like maths and sciences, actually reading might not really be the best thing for them to do, but actually some more advanced problems or more challenging problems in those areas. And there's lots of different websites and resources that they can use to push themselves a little bit further in those subjects, which I'll come on to a bit later. But also it might be looking at things like virtual museum exhibits, it might be listening to TED Talks or listening to podcasts, or a whole range of different things. So there's lots of different formats that students might like to study in. And there's no specific set of resources they need to look through for each subject area either. It's all about the student developing their own interests, and thinking more about what they enjoy within their subject area. So there's a whole range of different things that students can look at, but I'm going to go through some different ideas that you might want to talk to your students about doing, and some of that will depend on their subject area or how they learn best. First up is reading. So when we talk about supercurricular or subject extension work, reading is often the first thing that people think about. And for a lot of courses, reading is a really good thing for students to do. So it's a good place to start in a lot of areas. Often we'll talk about wider reading, but it's not so much about wider reading where students might try and read hundreds and hundreds of books, but more about deeper reading and more directed reading. So where students will be more actively engaging with any text that they're looking at. So whether that's a book or a journal article, thinking more critically and analysing more of the text that they're looking at. So thinking about what's the argument, what's being covered in this book? Do I agree with it? If I don't agree with it, then why not? And what do I really think about that? So starting to be more critical and thoughtful about the work that they're looking at. Beyond that, it's helpful for students to keep a bit of a reading log or a diary of any supercurricular work that they're doing. So often students might read quite a few different things, and they might start doing that quite early in the application process. And they'll want to draw on some of this supercurricular work in things like their personal statement, or if they get invited to interview. So actually keeping a bit of a log with just key points, what did I read, what did I think about it, is a great place for them to pull some of that resource together, so they've got something to look back on, and also to help them make links between things that they're reading. Next up is project work. So if students have the opportunity to do things like AP Capstone, the extended project or extended essay, then it's definitely something that we would recommend they have a think about. It wouldn't usually form part of an offer. So at Cambridge, our typical offers are based on A-level, IB, AP or equivalent qualifications. But we would definitely recommend the extended project or equivalent because it helps students to make a really strong application. It's a structured way for them to do some of this supercurricular work. So it can help them to delve a little deeper into a subject that they find interesting. Ideally, it'd be something that's related to the course or subject area that they want to apply to at university, because it will help to get that linked supercurricular knowledge there as well. And then ultimately it helps them to work at a bit of a higher level, do some research and do some extended write-up as well. So develop some of those skills that they'll need for their university study. So definitely something to recommend students have a think about if they do have the opportunity to do that. There's lots of things that you can do in a more structured way in school to help students to develop some of these supercurricular skills. Some of that might be through things like extension classes, which you could timetable in for them. Again, this supercurricular work is really just about extending student thinking and broadening what they're looking at in their subject area. So some work that can push them a little bit above what they're doing at school or a little bit beyond to expand their subject knowledge in those extension classes is a good thing for them to do. Another thing which you might want to think about is whether you could timetable in some discussion groups within the subject area. So this might be, it might vary a bit the format depending on what subject it is that you're working in. But for something like arts and humanities, you could give them a piece of text to look through, ask the students to have a read through it, and then give them some discussion points to talk about. In something like sciences or maths, you could give them some maths problems or extended problems to look through, get the students to work through those, and again have some discussion with them about how they're working through it, and some discussion between the students as well. A lot of this is really similar to what students might expect from supervisions at Cambridge or from the interview process. So it kind of meets two purposes in that students can get that broader subject knowledge, but also get more comfortable with some of the ways that they might be assessed or taught at Cambridge. So that assessment is very similar to the interview process, but will also be similar to how they'd be taught in supervisions. So again, a good way for them to get that wider subject knowledge as well. I'd also encourage you to direct students to make use of lots of the great resources that universities have put together. At Cambridge, some of you might already be subscribed to things like our teachers newsletter or guidance counsellor updates. And this year we've launched an equivalent version of that for prospective students. So that's where we'll be promoting things like essay competitions or resources that have been added for prospective students. So, and a lot of those will be split by subject. So definitely encourage students to subscribe to that. They'll also get updates to things like events. So if they want to come to open days or other events, we'll make sure that they know about those regularly through the newsletter. And that goes about once per month. They also might have access to different online events that we're running. I'd say one of the really positive outcomes from the pandemic is that actually some of the events that we've run are now much more accessible to international students. So something like the subject masterclasses we've been running at Cambridge for a number of years, and usually these are events that run in person. They've been a bit on hold for the past few months, but we're looking at relaunching those in the next few months, and they'll be running in an online format this year. So those subject masterclasses are subject focused on a specific subject area. They usually have 2 to 3 sessions and last a couple of hours. So a couple of academic taster sessions, which are led by lecturers or academics in that area, and an admissions session, so to recap on how the application process works in a specific subject. So definitely recommend that students have a look at those, and we'll keep everyone updated when they relaunch through both of the newsletters. Something we get asked about quite a lot is whether students need work experience. And actually, for the majority of our courses, work experience isn't something that they definitely need. Actually, in a lot of our courses, doing more supercurricular work is probably a better use of their time, because we want them to show that subject knowledge. So if they're doing work experience which isn't really related, it won't necessarily help their application. So spending more time on the supercurricular is probably a better thing for them to do. That said, in a couple of subjects, so where it's more of a vocational subject, work experience can be really helpful. In particular at Cambridge, that's looking at things like the medicine and veterinary medicine courses. The reason it's a little bit different for those subjects is because those courses, students are applying to do the university course, but ultimately with the idea that they'll go into a career in that sector afterwards. So we want to know that they've got a really realistic idea about what the job's going to involve and whether they'd actually enjoy that and get on well with that career. So work experience can help them to have a realistic insight into what it's actually going to be like. That said, we really understand that this year work experience isn't something which is as easy to come by as it might have been in previous years. So work experience can be challenging to organise in a normal year, but we understand that this year in the pandemic, actually students aren't going to be able to go into some of these settings, and we certainly wouldn't want them to put themselves in a situation where they or the people close to them aren't safe because of that. So this year there are lots of different things that students can do to get a good idea about what the career is going to evolve without doing more of that formal work experience. For veterinary medicine, have a look on the course page on our website. There's some good ideas from the department about what they can do. And one in particular is looking at an online MOOC, which some of the vet schools have collaboratively put together this year to give students a real insight into working in that area. For medicine, there is a great resource put together by the Medical Schools Council, which again runs through some different ideas about things that students can do this year. In particular, perhaps keeping a log of things that are going on in the news to do with that subject area and what students are thinking about that. Or again, looking at things like virtual work experience, which some other universities have put together. So do encourage students to go and have a look at those if that's the subject and career that they're looking at working towards. I mentioned at the very beginning that there's no set format for what students have to do for their super curricular work. So it's all about students trying to explore their subject in more detail, working out what they're interested in and how they learn best. So doing some reading, doing some of that problem work is great, but they also might want to look at things like keeping up to date on the news. That will really depend on what subject it is that they're applying to. But for some courses, keeping up to date on the news will really help them to keep up to date with what's going on in their subject area too. Also looking at things like online journal articles. They could ask you for some recommendations. So if you're a specialist in a particular subject area, often we'll say to students to check in with their teachers about what kind of things they'd recommend. So if there's any particular things that you can recommend in a subject area for students, that will help. Or again, if you're not sure or they're not sure, some universities will have first year reading lists available, which students can have a look through to get a good idea about what kind of things they might want to start looking at. Things like iTunes or online MOOCs, so listening to podcasts, watching TED Talks, there's loads of different things that are out there, and there'll be even more things that are beyond this presentation as well. So super curricular content and format can be really broad. So do encourage students to really think about what interests them the most. We've put together lots of resources by subject for students who don't really know where to start. So this top link is through to a PDF which the colleges and departments put together in the pandemic last year. And that's where you'll find lots of resources split out by all of the courses that students might want to study at Cambridge. And there's loads of different ideas for different starting points. So do send students there for a little look. Or if you need inspiration for things like discussion groups or activities you might want to look at in school, that's a good place to start as well. HE Plus is quite similar. So that's this top picture on the right hand side is a link through to the HE Plus website. And again, there you'll find things split by subject, different articles and resources they can look at and different work to work through. So if students aren't really sure where to start, they're good places to point them in the direction of. The bottom two links are a bit more specific to the sciences. So Isaac Physics is this picture on the bottom right, and that's got, I think, over 1,000 physics problems on the site, ranging from whole different levels from GCSE right through to university level. And that will help students to start doing some work a bit beyond what they're doing in school and get a better insight into what that's going to be like at a higher level. So keep stretching themselves beyond what they're doing in sciences at school. And again, engineering, I want to study engineering.com, a very aptly named website where students can have a look at different resources that will give them a better insight into what engineering is going to be like at that higher level. And on here, there's pictures of loads of different things that students can have a look at. So as you know, there's a whole range, and a lot of these are journals that they might want to have a look at. So they should be able to click through to some of these. In things like maths, actually just doing a bit more maths can help students to get that broader knowledge and more embedded subject knowledge. So these two websites, the Advanced Maths website and the Enrich websites, are good resources to point them towards in maths in particular. At the bottom, you'll see a big stack of books, and that stack of books is the Oxford Very Short Introduction books. which are a whole series put together by academics, which do what they say, really give students or give you an introduction to a specific subject area. And they're about 100 pages in length. And again, a good place for students to start and get some of that subject insight and supercurricular work. At the very beginning, I talked to you a bit about extracurricular, and extracurricular is really for us anything that's not related to the subject. So supercurricular linked and extracurricular isn't linked to the subject. And that's anything like sport or volunteering or music, which we should say all of these things we know are really good for students to do. They're great for student well-being. They help them to get some of that work-life balance, and it's good for developing their time management skills. The reason we don't look at it as part of the application process is because we're really focusing on assessing that academic ability and potential. So we want to look at all of the things that relate to that in the application process, and we won't look at the extracurricular part. But also I should say that students will have the opportunity to do these things at Cambridge, and we have lots of student societies and sports in a whole range of different levels and different types of activity that students can get involved in. And we do encourage students to get that work-life balance at Cambridge too. So while it's not something we look at in the application process, it's absolutely something they can still do as a student while they're studying with us. And I hope this has given you some initial ideas about where students can get started with their supercurricular work. I wanted to finish by saying about how students can fit this into the application process, and in particular into their personal statement. So this is their one-page statement that they put in as part of their UCAS application. It will come to all of the universities that they're applying to. So some of this advice is specific to Cambridge, but some a bit more broad as well. At Cambridge, we're going to be focusing on the academic content. So we want to see at least 80% focused on their academic experience, and then up to 20% on extracurricular. The reason we say to still include the extracurricular is because even though they're applying to Cambridge, we know that this statement will go to up to 4 other universities. And whilst we won't look at this in much detail, other universities will still want to see that as part of the statement. So it's absolutely fine for students to still include that in their personal statement, which comes to us as well. What we want to see in that big academic section is for them to demonstrate some of their subject interest, why they're interested in the course, and really show how they've gone into a bit more detail in that subject area, and what they think about it and how they learn. So really in that academic section, it's better for them to pick a few examples and go into a bit more depth about those than try to cover off absolutely everything that they know. We're not expecting them to list hundreds and hundreds of things in this statement, but just to give us a bit of a snapshot about things that they've read and what they found interesting, to give us an insight into what's made them apply to that course and what they'll enjoy about studying it. It's worth saying as well that actually students might be asked about some of these things at the interview too. So if they do get invited to interview, they should have a scan over things that they mentioned in this statement, and also make sure that they do still keep doing some of this supercurricular work between the time they submit their application and the next parts of the application process as well. Their interviewer might ask them about what have they done since they submitted their application, what have they been reading recently, or what have they looked at recently. So do encourage them to keep going with that even after they've submitted the application too. I hope this presentation has given you some ideas for supercurricular. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to speak to some of you as part of the conference. And if you do have any questions, do just let me or one of the team know. Thank you.